Zombie Dating, The Hard Problem of Consciousness, written by David Christopher Lane, narrated by Jason Zenobia. Zombie Consciousness 101. Alan Turing, the Virtual Simulator Hypothesis, and Recalibrating the Hard Problem. I thoroughly enjoyed Andrew P. Smith's recent essay, Consciousness So Simple, So Complex. I thought it was quite well written and demonstrated a deep engagement with Tononi's and Koch's integrated information theory concerning consciousness. I particularly liked Smith's detailed distinction between unconscious and conscious processes and the necessity of the former for the latter. Writes Smith, "So while our conscious experience is indeed highly integrated, a great deal of that integration takes place unconsciously. Consciousness is often described as where it all comes together, but it has already come together to a considerable degree before we are conscious." What most caught my attention, however, was Smith's invocation of what has been called in various intellectual quarters as the zombie argument, which has parallels, even if not precisely, with Searle's Chinese room argument. As Smith explains, one could imagine a zombie, a being behaviorally identical to a human being but lacking in consciousness, playing a musical instrument in exactly the same fashion as an ordinary human. Its brain would still have to unify the different sensory modalities. If it didn't, it couldn't perform the musical composition correctly, and we could certainly imagine something like Koch's view of integrated information enabling it to do so. But the zombie would still lack conscious experience of playing the instrument. Comparing the zombie to an actual human being, there is something missing, and that missing something is not obviously provided for by integrated information. The zombie dilemma, of course, raises the age-old philosophical issue of other minds. While I can be quite certain of my own subjective experience, the qualia of this or that occurrence, the same cannot be said about my perception of other beings. In other words, I may have great confidence in my own self-reflective awareness, but when it comes to you, the other, I am not so sure. I have, in a series of articles, touched upon this conundrum, particularly in Is My iPhone Conscious? And The Disneyland of Consciousness, since it is one that seems elemental to why such awareness may have evolved in the first place. As humans, we tend to impute conscious intentionality upon a whole host of materials outside of ourselves. Depending on the time and space, we may animate the sun, moon, and an array of planets and stars. Or we may impute soul-like qualities to mountains, rivers, trees, or even certain precious stones or metals. Daniel Dennett, the distinguished professor of philosophy at Tufts University, has long argued that taking intentional stances allows us to develop predictive models of how others may behave. As the Conscious Entities website clearly explains, according to Daniel Dennett, there is, in the final analysis, nothing fundamentally inexplicable about the way we attribute intentions and conscious feelings to people. We often attribute feelings or intentions, metaphorically, to non-human things, after all. We might say our car is a bit tired today, or that our pot plant is thirsty. At the end of the day, our attitude to other human beings is just a version, a much more sophisticated version, of the same strategy. Attributing intentions to human animals makes it much easier to work out what their behavior is likely to be. It pays us, in short, to adopt the intentional stance when trying to understand human beings. Taking such intentional stances, however, doesn't mean that the object we are currently animating, lightening, say, necessarily has that particular attribute. No, it's just that such psychic transferences provide us with a stratagem with which to act or react. This naturally leads to the contentious issue of zombie consciousness, since the very word conjures up all sorts of definitions ranging from the rudimentary, a person who moves very slowly and is not aware of what is happening, especially because of being very tired, which sounds like my brother early on Saturday morning, to the specifically magical. A will-less and speechless human in the West Indies, capable only of automatic movement, who is held to have died and been supernaturally reanimated. What seems to be common among almost all zombie definitions is that the person looks and acts a human being, but inside is soulless or unconscious of what he or she is doing, which in most horror movie versions is when it is trying to eat another person, who is usually all too aware of what is happening. Yet this begs a much larger question. How do we really know that the zombie is merely a mindless automaton? The obvious answer is that we don't. For instance, medical doctors have only recently come to realize that some coma patients, who they mistakenly believed were in a completely vegetative, non-aware state, were in fact quite conscious, but were unable to communicate such outwardly. The case of Ron Huben is a chilling case in point, as the Daily Mail in the UK reported. A car crash victim has spoken of the horror he endured for 23 years after he was misdiagnosed as being in a coma when he was conscious the whole time. Ron Huben, trapped in his paralyzed body after a car crash, described his real-life nightmare as he screamed to doctors that he could hear them, but could make no sound. I screamed, but there was nothing to hear, said Mr. Huben, now 46, who doctors thought was in a persistent vegetative state. I dreamed myself away, he added, tapping his tail out with the aid of a computer. Doctors used a range of coma tests before reluctantly concluding that his consciousness was extinct. But 3 years ago, new high-tech scans showed his brain was still functioning almost completely normally. Mr. Huben described the moment as my second birth. Therapy has since allowed him to tap out messages on a computer screen. Mr. Huben said, "All that time I just literally dreamed of a better life. Frustration is too small a word to describe what I felt." His case has only just been revealed in a scientific paper released by the man who saved him, top neurological expert Dr. Stephen Lauries. Medical advances caught up with him, said Dr. Lauries, who believes there may be many similar cases of false comas around the world. The disclosure will also renew the right to die debate over whether people in comas are truly unconscious. The world of appearances can be a beguiling and deceiving arena indeed. We tend to make quick and ad hoc judgments when rushed, so that if something walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks like a duck, we are convinced it really is a duck, forgetting in the process that it may be nothing of the sort. We now live at a time where CGI effects are so convincing that it is becoming nearly impossible to distinguish a manufactured image from a real one. We are fast approaching the time when the Turing Test, in which a computational device will be able to trick us into believing that it is human, will be routinely passed, and where the dividing line between artificial and human intelligence will most likely be forever blurred. I raise this issue because I think the zombie argument is a misleading one, since it assumes, wrongly I suggest, that we know a priori that the creature in question is somehow devoid of what we ourselves possess. But how do we even know this except by exterior observation, which is precisely how we adjudicate whether other humanoids have minds similar to our own? This is an epistemological cul-de-sac, since we at present don't have the ability to know what it is like to be a zombie, or even a bat, as Nagel cautioned decades ago. And if this is true, then the zombie hypothesis is a non-starter, because we are stuck within the limits of our subjective universe. We simply cannot, a priori, deny the qualia of another, whether it is our lover, our dog, or a zombie standing next to us at McDonald's ordering French fries. It appears we are trapped, at least temporarily, within a biological version of Plato's allegory of the cave, where we are bound to interpreting mere tracings and then inferring what such sketching may portend. This, it can be argued, is the real, hard problem of consciousness. As Sam Harris, notwithstanding his neuroscience background, admits, the problem, however, is that no evidence for consciousness exists in the physical world. Physical events are simply mute as to whether it is like something, to be what they are. The only thing in this universe that attests to the existence of consciousness is consciousness itself. The only clue to subjectivity as such is subjectivity. Absolutely nothing about a brain, when surveyed as a physical system, suggests that it is a locus of experience. Were we not already brimming with consciousness ourselves, we would find no evidence of it in the physical universe, nor would we have any notion of the many experiential states that it gives rise to. The painfulness of pain, for instance, puts in an appearance only in consciousness, and no description of C fibers or pain-avoiding behavior will bring the subjective reality into view. John Searle tackles this dilemma using a linguistic pointer when he argues that any and all third-person descriptors cannot provide us with the internal view of our first-person experiences. Therefore, the complexity of any neural system, though it may or may not be necessary for self-reflective consciousness, cannot in itself, as a set of data points, provide us with what it is like to be a jellyfish, a gold ring, or an extraterrestrial, since subjective components cannot be captured objectively, try as we might. Harris elaborates on this when he argues, "It is possible that some robots are conscious, if consciousness is the sort of thing that comes into being purely by virtue of information processing, then even our cell phones and coffee makers may be conscious. But few of us imagine that there is something that it is like to be even the most advanced computer. Whatever its relationship to information processing, consciousness is an internal reality that cannot necessarily be appreciated from the outside and need not be associated with behavior or responsiveness to stimuli. If you doubt this, you must read The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, Jean-Dominique Bauby's astonishing and heartbreaking account of his own locked-in syndrome, which he dictated by signing to a nurse with his left eyelid, and then try to imagine what his predicament would have been if even this degree of motor control had been denied him. In this way, we seem to be stuck in a Skinnerian black box. All we can surmise about anyone else is our own intentional stances projected outwardly, that we confirm or disconfirm by our increasingly sophisticated observations, which are exponentially aided by our technological prowess. Yet, even here, we are still caught within a neurological storefront that can only provide us with a menu of possible entry states, but which cannot give us the taste of that specific internal realm. We are, in sum, onlookers to the subjective realm. Or, to bastardize a famous quote from Rudyard Kipling, "Subjective is subjective, and objective is objective, and never the twain shall meet." It is for this reason that humans have had a long history of mistaking something inanimate as animate, and vice versa. Disneyland is full of animatronic characters, zombies, that have befooled many a visitor into thinking that they were real humans putting on a performance. Just as we can mistakenly believe that a comatose person is vegetative, we can also quite innocently presume that the animatronic in Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln on Main Street in Disneyland is a normal human being. Therefore, the zombie argument doesn't actually illuminate the hard problem of consciousness, but only obfuscates the knotty issue of what it is like to be something other than what we ourselves are. Andrew Smith illuminates on this when he writes, "In fact, much of our actual behavior is not that far removed from Zombieland. When an accomplished professional musician performs, most of what the brain does is carried out unconsciously. As has been recognized for decades, this is one of the major distinctions between an expert and a novice with regard to any form of behavior. The novice initially has to be conscious of nearly every detail of the performance, whereas for the expert, someone who has practiced the behavior extensively in the past, the performance is mostly automatic. This is very clear evidence that a vast amount of integration of information in the brain is carried out unconsciously. But perhaps there is no hard problem in consciousness as posited by David Chalmers and others, and we have only made it hard or harder, as Dennett has suggested in his recent book Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking, by claiming that it is. In this contrarian view, the way to understand consciousness is to assume, metaphorically speaking, that we are all zombies, and that what we take to be so unique in our first-person narratives is, on closer inspection, not as special or resistant to outside comprehension as we might presume. Daniel Dennett has long championed the view that consciousness can be explained provided that we recalibrate how we view our own notion of what it means to have a self. As Dennett argues, it's, consciousness, astonishingly wonderful, but it is not a miracle and it isn't magic. It's a bunch of tricks, and I like the comparison with magic because stage magic, of course, is not magic. It's a bunch of tricks, and consciousness is a bunch of tricks in the brain, and we're learning what those tricks are and how they fit together, and why it seems to be so much more than that bunch of tricks. Now, for a lot of people, the very suggestion that that might be so is offensive or repugnant. They really don't like that idea, and they view it as in a sort of an assault on their dignity or their specialness, and I think that's a prime mistake. One way to tackle this divided take on consciousness, whether a soft or hard problem, is to follow Gerald Edelman's lead and define awareness in a twofold way. First nature, or primary awareness, is of the present moment and the immediate past and can be understood as sensory consciousness or sentience itself. Second nature, or higher-order awareness, is when we can deeply reflect upon past, present, or future actions and have the ability to be cognizant of our self-consciousness, awareness of awareness, so to speak. This can also be passed as first nature being association, in the moment and in tune with prevalent proceedings, or zoning in, and dissociation, out of sync with what is occurring and ruminating about past or future activities, or zoning out. Analogously, primary consciousness is an engaged moment, whereas secondary consciousness is disengaged, to the point where one is somewhere else, mentally speaking. Edelman makes these distinctions since he feels that most, if not all, animals have some sense of primary awareness or sentience, whereas secondary or higher-order awareness may be only the lot of those with more highly ordered and complex brain structures. Why evolution would have evolved such a sophisticated form of awareness isn't as intractable as it may at first seem. Again, Andrew P. Smith touches upon this when he asks the question of why consciousness would have evolved when apparently an unconscious zombie could have the same functional advantages. Putting aside the ontological question of what zombies may or may not experience subjectively, I think it is fairly obvious what evolutionary benefit higher-order consciousness conveys upon those who have it. Any organism that can virtually simulate varying options within itself before outsourcing them in a real empirical world has a tremendous advantage over creatures who lack such a simulacrum Rolodex. Think about what your consciousness does most of the time, particularly during an uneventful and tedious lecture on consciousness itself. It spaces out. We tend to dissociate and ruminate about all sorts of things, from fantasizing about this or that person, or imagining what we are going to do on vacation, or perhaps if the lecture doesn't go too long, about what we are going to order at Veggie Grill. These mind wanderings allow us to conjure up all sorts of real and unreal possibilities, and as such allow us the opportunity to play out different endgame scenarios without ending up injured or dead. Those who lack such an internal theatre don't have the ability to rehearse, and thus are forced to act in a real and dangerous world almost immediately. There is, undoubtedly, a drawback to have such a conjuring mind, since it can, and often does, capture us in an admixture of fantastic phantasms which have no direct correlation to the eat-or-be-eaten world in which we live. We can also be subject to some truly horrifying delusions, such that it becomes nearly impossible to differentiate the exterior world from our interior machinations. This became clearer to me this past semester at Mount San Antonio College when I became well acquainted with an older student in my Introduction to Philosophy class. He introduced himself early in the semester after I had given a lecture on consciousness as a virtual simulator. He couldn't look me in the eye and explained that he hadn't left his house for nearly 20 years. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had an inordinate fear of people. His doctor had advised him to go back to school, and my class was the first one he was taking. He was mesmerized by the idea of the virtual simulator, since he felt that it explained his situation to a T. He then proceeded to write a long narrative in which he described in excruciating detail what a typical day in his life was like. Here is but one small excerpt. Now that I look back, I remember that I did experience mild panic attacks beginning at the tender age of 9 years old. I would sleep in a sitting position because I thought I was going to vomit my intestines if I slept lying down. I slept in this position for months. Now that I look back at this moment, I realize that this was just the beginning of the nightmare that lay ahead. You see, once a stubborn notion enters my mind, I cannot get rid of it. It completely takes over my mind and body. I guess I am so screwed up in my head that when a notion enters my mind, I get sick for days. My body gets overwhelmed with fear. I also begin to tremble, my head begins to hurt, and my stomach begins to turn. I sometimes even suffer from diarrhea. The sickness lets me know that a negative notion has entered my mind. If the notion was caused by wearing a new shirt, I either don't ever wear that shirt again, or I decide to put up with the sickness every time I wear it. I have been asking myself the same question for 20 years. How can something as harmless as a shirt cause so much mental and physical pain? I know the shirt is not to blame for my defective mind, but I would still love to know the scientific explanation from beginning to end. I always end up depriving myself of many simple pleasures in life because I have associated them with pain. Half of the things I own I don't use because a negative notion in my head developed that induces fear every time I try to use these items. For example, I bought an expensive stereo a few years ago and I haven't touched it since then. I'm afraid that my head is going to explode if I listen to the stereo. That is the crippling belief that exists in my mind. Every time I try to use these items, a rush of fear takes over me and I begin to perspire. My stomach begins to turn and I immediately begin to get sick. If I'm ever in a rare, happy mood, all I have to do is reach out for one of these items and fear and sickness will wreak havoc on my body and mind. As I got to know this student, we would invariably talk at length after our class was over. I realized how brilliant he was. Indeed, he was by far the brightest student I had taught in years, since he seemed to grasp almost any complex subject immediately, despite not having any academic training per se. What truly surprised me, though, was that once he understood the virtual simulator hypothesis, it noticeably calmed him down tremendously because the model helped him better understand his own behavior and how he was fueling, even if unconsciously, his own obsessive behavior and getting trapped within it. Over the course of the term, he even began to make prolonged eye contact and to develop a sense of humor about his predicament. This student also claimed to have improved more in the past few weeks than he had in 10 years of seeing his psychiatrist. It may well be that if we are convinced in the rightness of a theory and how it applies to our own situation, it can liberate us to some degree from our own guilt and our own consternations. For example, I have noticed that a medical condition can dramatically improve if I receive a proper diagnosis that I can firmly believe is accurate. Clearly, the placebo effect is a powerful one across all fields, including those suffering from certain mental illnesses. Higher-order consciousness may provide a tremendous advantage for us to live within our heads before acting out varying plans, but it can also boomerang against us since we have a tendency to conflate our dreams with the world around. To the degree that our internal models help us navigate and survive, it is a tool of incalculable power. But to the degree that it binds us into mistakenly believing, without sufficient evidence, our own imaginings, we can become prisoners within its hallucinatory walls. It can be argued that we are all delusional to some extent, since many of our delusions, religious or otherwise, allow us to buffer ourselves from the stark reality that the planet we find ourselves foraging about is a death machine where no one gets out alive. Consciousness as a virtual simulator, Edelman's second nature, may have evolved not only to help us with developing ways to strategize, but also to distract us from our precarious predicament. As my student once quipped to me, too much reality and we become catatonic, and too much fantasy and we become schizophrenic. Perhaps most importantly, certain aspects of the virtual simulator hypothesis have been tested and are garnering impressive results. New Scientist recently reported that thinking about a certain activity, such as juggling skills, before doing it, could significantly improve one's ability later on. Sukle Liu and her colleagues from the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke in Bethesda, Maryland, asked 8 adults to watch a circle on a screen while an fMRI machine scanned their brain. When the circle turned into a triangle, the volunteers moved their fingers. This movement caused activity in their premotor cortex and supplementary motor cortex, brain areas involved in imagining moving and actually moving, which in turn raised a bar on the screen. The more synchronized the brain activity, the higher the bar went. More synchronization has previously been linked with better performance in movement tasks. The researchers then asked the volunteers to imagine performing a complicated action, whatever they liked, as long as it increased the height of the bar. This enabled them to develop a way of improving coordination between the brain regions using thought alone. After an hour of mental practice, participants were 10% faster at a manual task. Those who showed the greatest increase in speed also showed the greatest enhancement in synchronization. Interestingly, some neuropsychologists believe that our sense of a self developed after, not before, we evolved ways to envisage, via intentional stances, why others behaved the way they do. In other words, we became adept at projecting prior to becoming adept at reflecting. Ironically, this inverse reasoning implies that zombie consciousness precedes self-awareness, since the former, unconscious processing, is a forerunner of the latter. If our nocturnal sojourns are an indication of our ancestral past, then it might be correct to surmise that we learned to dream before we could scheme. Smith rightly touches upon the importance of unconscious processing and integration as a necessary prelude to conscious self-awareness, and suggests that any theory of consciousness should take into consideration that what is unconscious to us as humans may be conscious to animals devoid of higher-order awareness. It is certainly true that whenever we learn a new skill, such as surfing, we have to be keenly aware of almost everything we do at first. How to paddle, how to sit on a board, how to catch a wave, how to stand up quickly as the wave crashes, how to bottom turn, and so on. But once we have mastered such a set of skills, they become automatic reflexes, and we act more instinctively. We no longer need to pay such close attention to them, as they have become unconscious reflexes, so to say. Tom Curran, a 3-time world champion surfer, once explained that his very best surfing was when he was mostly mindless, and instead of being conscious of each and every turn, he simply rode the wave and responded accordingly. but this can only happen after many hours of concentrated attention. In this way, one could argue that the zombie argument of consciousness should be placed on its head, and the bad pun here is purely intentional, since we only become zombie-like after, not before, being fully aware. In this context, therefore, zombie consciousness doesn't necessarily indicate that a person or object is mindless at all, but rather that they might have been so mindful at one stage that they later earned the luxury of tuning and zoning out whenever possible. This may explain why all those people driving cars after work in downtown Los Angeles look like zombies from The Night of the Living Dead. Zombie dating. Are brain states equal to mental states? A reflection on the hard problem of consciousness. Before I begin my reflection on zombie consciousness and the hard problem, I want to congratulate Andy Smith on his magnificent essay, What Good is Consciousness Anyway? He lays out his points very clearly and has quite properly placed the hard problem of consciousness in an evolutionary context. Smith's essay deserves close study since it is one of the most cogent presentations I have ever read on this subject, which is usually mired in technical jargon and obscurity. My response is more of a reflection than a rebuttal on what Andy has written, since there are many angles to the study of consciousness and the jury is still out about where all of this will end up. I just know for myself that Smith has got me thinking anew on this subject, and for that I give him my deepest thanks. Michael Lacewing at the University of London illustrates the intrinsic difficulty of the zombie hypothesis by underlining its inconceivability in the following handout that he made for his class to tackle the problem. 1. A zombie is a physical duplicate of a person with phenomenal consciousness, but without phenomenal consciousness. A physical duplicate is a functional duplicate. Therefore, a zombie is a physical and functional duplicate of a person, but without phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal properties are physical properties realizing particular functional roles. Therefore, a physical and functional duplicate of a person with consciousness has phenomenal consciousness. A physical and functional duplicate of a person with consciousness cannot both have and lack phenomenal consciousness. Therefore, zombies are inconceivable. As philosopher Saul Kripke famously argued, if A is identical to B, then A and B are the same thing. It's not possible for A to be B, and for it not to be B. If A is B, then A is B in every possible world. Along these contentious lines, one can argue that if a supposed zombie has all the neural correlates that we as humans have, the same exact brain structure, for instance, then it would, by that very definition and functionality, have consciousness. This, of course, dovetails with Giulio Tononi's Integrated Information Theory, IIT, where, given the complexity of certain material substrates, one can determine the relative level of phi. Given any such system, the theory predicts whether that system is conscious, to what degree it is conscious, and what particular experience it is having. See central identity. According to IIT, a system's consciousness is determined by its causal properties and is therefore an intrinsic, fundamental property of any physical system. While the zombie idea seems to illuminate the hard problem of consciousness, I suspect that what it does is actually beg the question by allowing us to imagine something that is, in terms of our own consciousness, unimaginable. This is akin to that classic philosophical query which asks us the following: if a tree falls in the forest and there is no one to hear it, does it make a sound? On the surface, this may seem to be a reasonable, even important question. But on deeper inspection, it turns out to be a fake conundrum, since it arises from a semantic confusion, similar to, "Hey Dave, have you stopped beating your wife? Yes or no?" The only way to accurately respond to such an either-or question is to usurp the question itself and explain that it is ill-framed and as such presumes far too much in its grammatical construction. Therefore, I think Andy Smith is assuming far too much when he argues the following. The short answer is that a zombie does not feel guilt, remorse, etc., but it has the same underlying brain activity that, according to materialism, results in the same behavior. Ask yourself, for example, how is the feeling of guilt going to affect what you do? Are you going to apologize to someone? Are you going to change some behavior which you regret so that you act differently in the future? Are you just going to mope around for a while? Whatever it is, a zombie can do the same thing. The idea that the zombie is identical in every way to me physically means, along the lines of Kripke's logical syllogism, that he is me and thus would have self-reflective awareness and wouldn't be a mindless automaton. Put differently, to imagine that a zombie has the same functional neural correlates of a human being with self-reflective awareness is to actually define such as a human being and not as a zombie. This means that the hard problem of consciousness is directly related to our difficulty in understanding how particular physical forms of complexity lead to certain forms of awareness and how they mirror each other. As Patricia Churchland might put it, brain states are mental states. If this is true, we should, given the recent work in IIT, be able to predict whether specific complex physical systems have consciousness or not. In this context, there are indeed very good reasons why evolution would have favored complex physical systems of a certain kind, because those very systems would, by such complexity, house sophisticated forms of self-reflective awareness which have the ability to in-source varying actions before outsourcing them in a real world exterior to itself. Therefore, natural selection doesn't have to adjudicate the interior forms of awareness, since the exterior complexity that houses such is sufficient to be passed on. Why? Because that particular brain, by its very structure, produces the virtual simulation advantage, and therefore is a favored trait that has emerged among higher primates. Thus, the hard problem of consciousness is truly a physical problem that needs to be resolved, since they are not mutually exclusive. The physicalist response to the zombie hypothesis is summarized by Lacewing when he writes, "The fact that we can conceive of zombies doesn't show that zombies are metaphysically possible. If phenomenal properties just are certain physical and/or functional properties, then it isn't possible for zombies to exist. Given the physical properties we have, if physicalism is true, it just isn't possible for a being with the same physical properties not to have consciousness as well." Already, progress has been made in IIT. In a recent paper published in the Frontiers of Human Neuroscience, estimating the integrated information measure phi from high-density electroencephalography during states of consciousness in humans, the authors conclude their highly technical study with the following summation. Essentially, the physicalist argument boils down to this: phenomenal properties cannot differ independently of physical properties. This, if true, disqualifies the zombie objection. However, we are still in a very rudimentary stage in understanding consciousness, so I think it would be highly premature on my part to say that P equals P, and that settles the argument. Rather, Andy Smith is opening the door to another possibility that we should take seriously, even if it contravenes our own pet biases. The zombie hypothesis presupposes that there could, in fact, be physical systems that are identical to our own, but which do not have self-reflective awareness such as we possess. They are, to crib an oft-used cliché, soulless automatons. If this is true, why then would evolution have favored those with self-reflective awareness and not mindless bots, if both can exhibit the exact same behavior? As Andy Smith explains, Since only our behavior, not how we experience it, can be subject to selection, consciousness adds nothing that could be the basis for natural selection to act on. The short answer is that a zombie does not feel guilt, remorse, etc., but it has the same underlying brain activity that, according to materialism, results in the same behavior. Ask yourself, for example, how is the feeling of guilt going to affect what you do? Are you going to apologize to someone? Are you going to change some behavior which you regret so that you act differently in the future? Are you just going to mope around for a while? Whatever it is, a zombie can do the same thing. The objection here, of course, is that natural selection is not a force per se, but rather a description of what organisms survive in any competitive eco-niche and thus passes on those favorable traits which allowed it to pass on its genetic code. So it is not that evolution is acting on anything per se, but rather that we are describing after-the-fact results and then imputing why such and such organisms may have survived nature's sieving process. If sufficiently complex neuronal systems must have attendant subjective forms of awareness which are intertwined with them, then evolution would indeed favor such organisms without having to know the internal states of such. Hence, our experience and our consciousness in this context does indeed add to our survival and would have been selected for, not against, even if nature would be blind to such interior states of being. Therefore, this notion would append Andy Smith's conclusion when he writes, "So to me, the conclusion that consciousness in the hard sense has no survival value is obvious." Quite the opposite. If we accept on some level that mental states are brain states, then there is enormous value to our sense of qualia, and this, no doubt, would have been favored in our evolutionary history, since being able to virtually simulate varying possibilities with the attendant emotional feedback loops like guilt, desire, love, remorse, etc., gives us a tremendous advantage over creatures with less imaginative variability. I suspect that we will better confront the zombie notion of consciousness when we have completed our reverse engineering of the human brain and have mapped out, functionally, the complexity necessary to generate human-like awareness in computational simulations. If we do succeed in the latter, we will confront a fundamental ethical dilemma, because if a robot acts in every way like a human being, do we then have to confer on it the same rights and freedoms that we too possess? If consciousness is indeed substrate neutral and only dependent on sufficiently complex networking, then it will revolutionize not only our understanding of consciousness, but what it means to be human. We will undergo a radical transformation that is even greater than what was achieved in the Copernican, Newtonian, Darwinian, and Einsteinian revolutions. In conclusion, I don't want to suggest that I have somehow figured out the knotty issue of consciousness. Far from it. Rather, it is only to point out that there are several avenues of thought on this subject, and I think it is wise to try on as many hats as possible to see through their various strengths and weaknesses. It may well be that we will end up agreeing with Colin McGinn and the Mysterianism school that proclaims consciousness is a mystery that human intelligence will never unravel. Or we could criticize the mind is brain idea as simply unintelligible or unimaginable, as Sam Harris does when he argues. Likewise, the idea that consciousness is identical to or emerged from unconscious physical events is, I would argue, impossible to properly conceive, which is to say that we can think we are thinking it, but we are mistaken. We can say the right words, of course. Consciousness emerges from unconscious information processing. We can also say some squares are as round as circles and 2 + 2 = 7. But are we really thinking these things all the way through? I don't think so. Consciousness, The sheer fact that this universe is illuminated by sentience is precisely what unconsciousness is not. And I believe that no description of unconscious complexity will fully account for it. It seems to me that just as something and nothing, however juxtaposed, can do no explanatory work, an analysis of purely physical processes will never yield a picture of consciousness. However, this is not to say that some other thesis about consciousness must be true. Consciousness may very well be the lawful product of unconscious information processing. But I don't know what that sentence means, and I don't think anyone else does either. I had likened our difficulty in studying consciousness to a Mobius strip in a previous essay, Inside, Outside, where I opined, perhaps the Mobius strip is a useful, albeit limited, metaphor here to invoke, since its unusual properties on first sight boggle the mind. A surface with only one side and only one boundary component. It has the mathematical property of being non-orientable. Analogously, the difficulty we have with studying consciousness is precisely that we cannot communicate what it is without losing the very quality that makes it such. Imagine that you wanted to convey what it was like to dream to someone who never dreamt and only had access to a waking state. How could you communicate dreaming without dreaming itself? Harris suggests strongly that you cannot, and that any attempt to circumvent the obvious is simply unintelligible. How can one convey something that is non-orientable to that which is only orientable, if one has to forego the very thing that would communicate it? Isn't the breakdown of consciousness, which is strategically speaking the reductionist paradigm of Crick, Churchland and others, precisely the problem, since it breaks apart the very thing that must be experienced as a gestalt? Consciousness isn't a thing to be described among other things, since it is the context, not the content of what is experienced. The Mobius strip is, by definition, an endless surface, and any attempt to reorient it, by definition, again, transforms it into that which it is not. Isn't consciousness akin to this very definitional paradox? My very attempt to correlate it or analogize it or reduce it or explain it simply appends a genuine understanding of what it is to experience it, since consciousness isn't a thing to be described among other things, since it is the context, not the content of what is experienced. More precisely, consciousness cannot be exported as a piece of content, since it is a whole context in which such appearances arise. My attempts to reduce that holism to parts ipso facto means that whatever follows will be irretrievably lost in translation. I concluded the same essay with this lament. In the study of consciousness, it appears we may have to confront an epistemological complementarity where any objective study, via third-person analysis, of qualia must by necessity lose in translation a fundamental feature of the very phenomenon under inspection. Conversely, any purely subjective endeavor to explore consciousness must by its very act forego any attempt to maximally objectify what is experienced, lest the experience itself be lost in attempting to exteriorize that which is de facto interior. A broken-down melody is, to quote one distinguished musician, no longer a melody. Similarly, a broken-down consciousness is no longer itself. Let me conclude by saying that Andy Smith has provided us with much fuel for thought, and I think what he writes necessitates taking a multi-layered view of consciousness, one which seriously considers the hard problem as he has presented it. It may well be that we will have to tackle the problem of consciousness with tools yet unimagined. My own hunch, though, is that those very tools won't be properly understood or utilized until we have completed our physical understanding of the brain and its housing. Ironically, by focusing on the physics of consciousness, we may eventually be opening possibilities beyond such limits. The Magical Mystery Tour of Matter. Back in the fall of 2010, my wife Andrea and I were asked to be one of the plenary speakers at an international conference called SpearCon, Spiritual Consciousness Studies, which was being held at the Dayal Educational Institute in Agra, India. We very much wanted to attend, but our youngest son, Kelly, was only 4 years old at the time, and we realized that it would be better to wait until he got older to make such a long trip. So instead, we decided to produce a 2-part movie and write an extended essay entitled Mysterium Tremendum, exploring why the conflict between science and spirituality is trapped in a linguistic conundrum. It was published on Integral World that same month and year, and later included in a book, along with a number of other essays by scholars in Asia and North America, printed in India, entitled Spiritual Consciousness, New Delhi, New Age Books, 2013. The underlying thesis of both the film and the essay was that matter is a term that is too often misunderstood, and because of this has led far too many religionists to assume that it is one-dimensional, flat, grey, and completely devoid of mystery. Our argument is that matter is the complete opposite of that misleading caricature. Rather, matter, etymologically speaking, the word has various originations, but my favorite is from the Latin mater, origin, source, mother. Though understood hierarchically and in multifarious ways, is ultimately a profound mystery at its base, which invites us on a magnificent adventure to explore its almost infinite array of complex and intersecting components. I think a pun I often use in my upper division science and religion courses at California State University, Long Beach, captures the essence of why we shouldn't be scared or dismissive of the physicalist quest. If we are just matter, what then is the matter? Simply put, saying something is just matter makes absolutely no sense, since there is nothing just about it. Do we say light is just light, or consciousness is just consciousness? No, because we realize that in each case we are confronting something that is wholly mysterious, even if we can understand differing aspects about it. I mention all of this as a necessary preface to Steve Taylor's latest essay, Beyond Belief, When Science Becomes a Religion, a response to Lane and Visser, which I enjoyed reading and which I believe outlines his position clearly and succinctly. Taylor has given us a cogent presentation that is worthy of closer analysis. Even though I disagree with much of what Taylor writes, I think the reason we appear to be arguing at opposite ends of the spectrum may be due, in part, to a definitional confusion which underpins and, at times, undermines our discussion. For instance, after our talk was aired in India, I was a bit startled to learn that it was quite well received, even by those who I had wrongly suspected would be most resistant to it. Only later, when P. Sriramamurthy, the distinguished professor of Sanskrit and editor of Spiritual Consciousness, personally visited me at my office at Mount San Antonio College, did I realize the reason why. Professor Sriramamurthy explained to me that there is a variant interpretation of Prakriti, usually translated as nature or primary substance, which instead of being seen as the opposite of Purusha, pure consciousness, is rather viewed as one unified whole. In the dualist Samkhya school of thinking, Prakriti represents the feminine, matter facet, and Purusha represents the masculine, soul, consciousness aspect. The former is the substrate of the latter and is often viewed as the essential constituent of the universe and is at the basis of all the activity of the creation. Prakriti is sometimes aligned with the concept of Maya, which is often understood in Buddhism as the power by which the universe becomes manifest, though it is most commonly used today to represent illusion, or that which betrays its real origin. Professor Sri Ramamurthy argued that matter and spirit are better understood as two ends of one rope, and though they appear quite distinct, they are, in truth, just different ways of understanding the universe. So, from his perspective, which dovetailed with mine, the real conundrum was definitional, since the deeper we explore material objects, the more we will see their intrinsic majesty. We have, of course, already seen this to be the case with the strange and mysterious world of quantum mechanics. Therefore, I don't see why we have such a resistance to fully exploring all that we see, hear, touch, and feel physically first, since matter itself has so many permutations at varying levels of momentum and position that have yet to be unearthed. We are like sailors who have just left port at Huntington Harbor to explore the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, but who get as far as Catalina Island, just 26 miles away, and set anchor down, saying among themselves that there is nothing else to see. Such voyaging, of course, doesn't preclude anyone else from embarking on a different journey with a different set of tools. The crux of Steve Taylor's argument, at least as how I read it, boils down to what I believe is an unnecessary dualism when he writes, "Life did not come into being through the accidental interactions of certain chemicals, but as the result of the innate tendency of the universe, propelled by consciousness itself, to move towards greater complexity. At a certain point, when material entities reached a certain degree of complexity, they became able to receive and transmit universal consciousness. This was when life began." I suggest that we simply don't know the ultimate reason of why the cosmos is as we find it, especially in light of such concepts as multiple universes, holographic event projections, and computer-simulated models ad infinitum, and that, as explorers, we should keep on seeking. I've noticed that one of the fundamental differences between traditional religion and science is that the former claims to already know the truth, whether it is revealed in the Christian Bible, the Muslim Quran, or Eckankar's Shariat ki Sukmat, whereas the latter starts from the position of unknowing, and because of this, wants to know more. I am ontologically ignorant about whether the universe is an accidental one, to cite Alan Lightman's pithy title from one of his most readable books, a virtual simulation created by alien friends of Elon Musk, who he has yet to formally meet, or a bizarre experiment run by a punk teenager who has nothing else to do in his own private parallel universe. Yes, we can know many things, such as how to make a car, build skyscrapers, and bake vegan chocolate cakes. But at this stage in human development and cognition, it is the height of folly to believe that we have even touched the surface of all that can be known physically about what surrounds us and what makes us tick. Therefore, saying something is a matter of focus and that science is mostly a practical endeavor shouldn't be confused with a metaphysical end game. We are nowhere near knowing what matter is and what it can portend under different conditions. No need to jump the gun here and say, well, since science has yet to explain NDEs, so-called psychic phenomena, and qualia, we should abandon ship. Geez, we've barely touched the surface of what physics, chemistry, biology, and psychology has in store for us. Let these pioneers keep voyaging and working. No one is blocking consciousness-first advocates of launching their own spiritual junkets. Let each of them bring back their bounties, and we can compare riches. I find it a bit too revealing and a bit too ironic that Steve Taylor's list of how the universe actually operates is dogmatic to the core, when he can, without caveats, list the following as tenets of his spiritual science. Life did not come into being through the accidental interactions of certain chemicals, but as the result of the innate tendency of the universe, propelled by consciousness itself, to move towards greater complexity. At a certain point, when material entities reached a certain degree of complexity, they became able to receive and transmit universal consciousness. This was when life began. Evolution is not an accidental process. Once life forms had come into existence, evolution was impelled by the innate tendency of consciousness to generate greater complexity. More complex life forms enabled universal consciousness to express itself more intensely, manifesting itself as individual consciousness. Rather than being just biological machines, human beings are, both mentally and physically, expressions of spirit or fundamental consciousness. As the previous point suggests, our individual consciousness, our subjective or inner life, is not generated by the brain. It is a fundamental universal quality which our brains receive and canalize into our individual being. Mental phenomena cannot be reduced to neurological activity. There may be correlations between mental and neurological activity, but there is certainly not a one-way causal link. Neurological changes can affect mental experience, but mental experience can also bring about neurological changes. In rereading Taylor's tenets, I must confess that I am duly impressed that he has already figured out exactly the purpose of life, the universe, and self-reflective awareness. I don't have such axiomatic beliefs, contrary to what he has impugned about me and others of a certain scientific bent. No, I am still in the hunt to know as much as I can, and I have found that a good way to derive more, not less, information about the cosmos is by studying it physically first, even if I meditate in a Ramana-like fashion, e.g. find the source of where the I arises, etc., 2 to 3 hours daily. Where my quest will end is both uncertain and unknown to me. Thus, before we castigate those who look for empirical causes and correlations and belabor their targeted efforts, we should be aware that they may not be as dogmatic as we mistakenly believe. Because any scientist worthy of that appellation will be the first to confess how little they do indeed know. Richard Feynman gave a beautiful and telling analogy about the humility of genuine scientists when he explained in a televised interview the following. When you're thinking about something that you don't understand, you have a terrible, uncomfortable feeling called confusion. It's a very difficult and unhappy business. And so, most of the time, you're rather unhappy, actually, with this confusion. You can't penetrate this thing. Now, is the confusions because we're all some kind of apes that are kind of stupid, working against this, trying to figure out how to put the two sticks together to reach the banana, and we can't quite make it, the idea? And I get this feeling all the time that I'm an ape trying to put two sticks together, so I always feel stupid. Once in a while, though, the sticks go together on me, and I reach the banana. Feynman further added that the scientific spirit is one of adventure, the adventure into the unknown, an unknown which must be recognized as being unknown in order to be explored. The demand that the unanswerable mysteries of the universe remain unanswered, the attitude that all is uncertain. To summarize it, the humility of the intellect. If I compare Feynman's approach to those of Taylor's tenets, I see a fundamental difference in their arcs. Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of the last century, doesn't start out with inviolate axioms, but compares himself with an ape, trying to reach a banana, and is doing his level best to do so. Does this very approach mean that he only studied physics to the exclusion of all else? or that his materialist bent discouraged him from studying Uri Geller or experimenting with psychoactive drugs, or taking weekly plunges in Dr. John Lilly's deprivation tanks, or experiencing out-of-body experiences. Not in the least, since he did all these things and more. Let me say here that I do appreciate Steve Taylor's continued efforts to explain his philosophical position, which he has done with great clarity and skill. I commend him for being forthcoming in articulating why he disagrees with me and Frank Visser and our respective purviews. While it is obviously clear that I don't agree with his unequivocal tenets as posted in his essay, I have enjoyed thinking through these issues with him and others. In conclusion, this may be a good time to reiterate my own philosophical leanings, since Steve Taylor has been so refreshingly transparent in his. I was once asked by Dodie Bellamy, the noted fiction writer from San Francisco, who interviewed me for a cover story on Ekankar in San Diego back in 1995, about my overall philosophy on life, to which I gave the following reply. Dave, what do you believe? I'm a mystical, agnostic materialist. What it means is that I ultimately don't know, and in my unknowingness, I like to explore how much more I don't know. Is this a scary position? I love it. I love unknowingness. Nowadays, I tell my philosophy and sociology students on the first day of class, I didn't know much when I was 2. I didn't know much when I was 22, and I still don't know much now that I am 62. The only real difference between then and now is that I can articulate my own stupidity much better. That is my metaphysical pathos. So, I look forward to any return volleys that may come this way in our intellectual game of to and fro. I may not necessarily always agree, or I might even give a sterner pushback, but I always learn more from those who have differing voices and differing ideas than my own. About the author. David Christopher Lane is a professor of philosophy at Mount San Antonio College and formerly a lecturer in religious studies at California State University, Long Beach. Professor Lane received his Ph.D. and M.A. in sociology from the University of California, San Diego, where he was a recipient of a Regents Fellowship. Additionally, he earned an M.A. in the history and phenomenology of religion from the Graduate Theological Union, Berkeley. Dr. Lane is the author of several books, including The Radhaswami Tradition and Exposing Cults, New York, Garland Publishers, 1992 and 1994, respectively. He is the founder of the Neuralsurfer website. Professor Lane won the World Body Surfing Championships in 1999 and the International Body Surfing Championships in 2016, 2015, 2014, 2011, 2004, 2000, 1998, and 1997. Dr. Lane is married to Dr. Andrea Diem Lane, who is also a professor of philosophy at Mount San Antonio College and the author of several books including The Gnostic Mystery, Darwin's DNA, and Spooky Physics. They have 2 boys, Kelly Joseph and Sean Michael. Currently, David Christopher Lane is engaged in writing a series of books on evolutionary philosophy. His most recent books include Tom Blake, A Surfer's Philosophy, The Neural Seduction, and The Yoga of Body Surfing. Dr. Lane has also written several illustrated texts on the interface of artificial intelligence and virtual reality in such books as The Avatar Project and The Virtual Reality of Consciousness. This has been Zombie Dating, The Hard Problem of Consciousness, written by David Christopher Lane, narrated by Jason Zenobia. Copyright 2019 by David Christopher Lane. Production copyright by David Christopher Lane.